Thank you all very much for coming. I'm a little bit hoarse tonight, so I'm going to be drinking water. But my intention is to talk about another one of the gentleman farms in Portsmouth. And I'll explain what those were in a minute. The first one was on Glen Farm, and the next one is going to be on Sandy Point Farm, which took over almost all of South Portsmouth back at the turn of the last century. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of different famous names tonight before we got the condo complex, but we'll start with this. So first one, this is the farmhouse originally, and this gentleman in the picture, I'll tell you later on who he is. I don't like to, by the way, I don't like to use a microphone unless I have to, because I keep waving it around and talking with it out here someplace. So if you can't hear me in the back row, please feel free to wave your arm and let me know. Okay, Oakland Farm. South Portsmouth, the southern part of Portsmouth, it actually was called South Portsmouth back in those days, was the location of several gentlemen's farms in the 1880-1910 period. We had Glen, Sandy Point, Greenvale, and tonight's subject, Oakland. And there were still some others also. Portsmouth, as you may or may not know, in the 19th century was very much a farming community. A lot of small farms. Well, there's an article, I had it at my last lecture, but there's an article in the newspaper from 1909 that says, "Poor Portsmouth has fallen into the backwater. It hasn't advanced the way Newport has. Thank God." And it's a really interesting article. It says some places you can't even get to the water because it's all overgrown. I think that's great. Anyway, Oakland has a very, as we all know, the Vanderbilts are associated with Oakland, but it has a really long history before that, and I'm going to cover some of that right now to give you a little bit of perspective on it. The Vanderbilts didn't move in until the 1890s. The roots of Oakland Farm go back to colonial days when the first settlers came here. They settled down in the area of of Island Park, down in that area, but they moved south very quickly and established rather significant farms all over the island. And then that was in 1638. And in 1639, 8 people got disillusioned with Portsmouth, more political than anything else, and so they decided to move further south on the island to establish Newport. We were first, and Newport doesn't like that very much, but that's okay. So they were around Founder's Brook, but very quickly they started developing 100-acre farms and so on further south. So in those days, Oakland Farm, when it was first established, extended from Union Street, actually north of Union Street, south, to include all the lands that are part of St. Mary's Church today. This is a tough map to read. It's an 1860 map, but this is a map of the area, and this is over here, if it works. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Over in this area, this is the West Main Road. Okay, here's Lawton's Valley right here.
Sorry.
It's okay. And on that area in the vicinity of where the Valley Inn is today, you have the name Cornell right here. And the Cornell family was not only at that end of Union Street, they were also at this end of it. And Oakland Farm was owned by the Cornell family back in the 1750, 1760 period. In 1778, we had a Revolutionary War battle fought in this area, and we were fortunate recently to get a whole set of about 16 maps of that action on the Battle of Rhode Island. And this is the one that involves the local area. Here's Union Street right here. Union Street was the first crossroad, by the way, between the east and west. The east and west main roads were laid out in 1640. But this was the first cross street. So where we are here today is right here. Why is this? I'm pushing this the wrong way. Right here. And the first skirmish, as the British came out from Newport this way out the West Main Road, the American, I'll say American, Army was waiting for them there. And they had a skirmish right out on this corner of the lot over here. And some of the people who were killed were buried across the street. The Americans then fell back, went back up Middle Road, and got to the area of Town Hall, and then went a little bit further to Fort Butts. Fort Butts, for us historians, is very much in the news these days. There's a lot of work being done up there, a lot of volunteer work cleaning it up, and hopefully in the next few years you're going to really see something about Fort Butts. And there's a lot of people in Portsmouth who have never knew Fort Butts was there. And hopefully we will put it on the map. That's a separate project from the Historical Society. We're kind of affiliated with it. Craig's one of the leaders in that organization. And we're getting a lot of support, nationwide support, for the reconstruction of Fort Butts, which is great. So there was a skirmish right out here on the road, right on the corner. Oakland Farm later was purchased, after the war, was purchased by the Gibbs and Channing firm. That was a merchant firm in Newport. And they purchased this, and it eventually fell into the hands of Mary Gibbs in 1813. Channing and Gibbs were important merchants of Newport who, during the Revolutionary War period. There was a family struggle in the Gibbs family. I won't go into the details on that, but there were 2 daughters and 2 brothers, and they fought over it. The farm itself, again, this is back to that first picture I showed you of the little tiny cottage in the woods there. Reverend William Ellery Channing, who was a minister in Boston, he spent a lot of time there in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. He was there and he wrote there, and actually, not this building, but the building that preceded this, he preached in this building. This building was replaced, the old building that was here, in 1865. This one was built in 1865. It's in pretty good shape for being something that old. Anyway, there was another building here that was removed from here, put on a Sisson farm down on Sandy Point Avenue, and it lasted there until about 1910, when it kind of eventually fell apart. But that was, the church building was here then. So Gibbs and Channing were very successful until 1807. But in 1807, the United States was getting into a situation of, who do we go to war with, Britain or France? And we were going to go to war with somebody. And the negotiations, the international relations were really chaotic. And finally, we decided that we would, President Jefferson decided he would establish an embargo act, which cut trade, and there were war prospects that led to the War of 1812. Well, by having an embargo act, you couldn't have a whole lot of trade with Britain or France. And so the Gibbs and Channing firm went out of business at that point. And they just couldn't get the trade. So Sarah Gibbs, she's the important person in the Gibbs family. She got life tenancy on Oakland Farm in 1826. And she donated land on the south end of the property to St. Mary's for, I'm sorry, let me back up. In 1844, she donated land that was used for the Church of the Holy Cross in Middletown, down there across where Benny's used to be. The architect was Richard Upjohn, who was a very important architect back in those days. And later, Sarah bought the Potter Farm, which was south of Oakland, and she donated it for construction of St. Mary's Church. And Upjohn, again, was probably, there's some question, probably the architect of that as well. And the church was dedicated in 1852. Sarah died in 1866, and if you've ever been to St. Mary's Church, you know where her grave is. It's that big, huge one just on the east side of the church itself. It's very prominently displayed there. She died in 1866. In 1867, Oakland was sold by the Gibbs heirs to August Belmont. Now, August Belmont, I hope you recognize this picture. He still sits down on the corner of Narragansett Avenue and Bellevue Avenue. That's his statue that's there. He was quite wealthy. He was involved in a lot of businesses back in the beginnings of the Gilded Age. Okay? In the post-Civil War era, he was very prominent. He also bought, in addition to Oakland Farm, on this side of the East Main Road, he also bought 50 acres across East Main Road from William Sisson. The Sissons owned a whole bunch of land all on the other side of the East Main Road. So Belmont sold the Oakland Farm to Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1886. Cornelius Vanderbilt lived from 1843 to 1899. He was the grandson of the Commodore, the original entrepreneur, shall we say, of the Vanderbilt family. And this Cornelius Vanderbilt was chairman of the board of the New York Central Railroad. Now, our view of the New York Central Railroad today is, well, it's this little thing that out there and so on. Well, in the 19th century, the New York Central Railroad was the predominant railroad in the country, compared very much with the Pennsylvania Railroad. But the New York Central went up from New York City and across the state of New York and kept on going. It really was the preeminent railroad of the day. And just to give you an idea of how widespread he was, this Cornelius Vanderbilt was involved in 35 other railroad corporations. They all did very well with railroads. And of course, railroads, keep in mind, in the 19th century, railroads were the primary means of transportation, especially for goods, but also for passenger traffic. We had our first transcontinental railroad finished. They tried to start them before the Civil War, but the first one was finished in 1867. And by 1876, there were 4 railroads that went across the country. Railroads were really big. Here's Cornelius himself, Cornelius II. Again, he died when he was 58. I think that's the right year. And by the way, he also financed the construction of the breakers in Newport. Okay, that's a little side hobby there in 1893. He died unexpectedly in 1899 at 56, and probably the wealthiest man in the country at that time. The Vanderbilts started out slow. The original Commodore started a ferry service from Staten Island to New York City, and eventually bought out everybody else that was involved in it. Then he started sending steamboats. Steamboats are another favorite topic of mine, by the way. He started sending steamboats up the Hudson River. And so he was very much involved in transportation at that point and built a huge fortune. He, by the way, had no association with Newport. He was one of the few moguls of that age that did not come to Newport. He was not involved here. Anyway, when Cornelius II died, his estate that was worth over $70 million, which in today's prices would probably be somewhere in the vicinity of 3 or 4 billion, was left mostly to his wife, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt. Alice of the Breakers, they called her. She continued to live there until her death in 1934. Alice Claypole Gwynne Vanderbilt, all dressed up for her portrait. So now we get down to Alfred Gwynne. Alfred Gwynne is one of the more interesting of the Vanderbilt family. He was born in New York City. He was the third son of Cornelius and Alice. Graduated from Yale University in 1899 and went into some of the family's railroad business. There's a new book that just came out about 3 weeks ago, by Anderson Cooper. You all know who he is. He's a Vanderbilt, by the way. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt. And Anderson Cooper writes this book. Essentially, the subtitle is The Decline of the Vanderbilt Family. And that's what happened. they, in the first half of the 20th century, trying to think of a polite way to say it, they divested themselves of much of their fortune. That's one way of saying it. I'll be polite. And Alfred was really part of that. He was the third son of Cornelius. His oldest brother married out of society and was condemned, essentially, by the rest of the family. And so that was Cornelius. And he was persona non grata as far as the family was concerned. Well, Alfred Gwynne was a sportsman. He was involved in hunting, especially he was involved in horses. He got involved in reviving a sport that had been started back in the 18th century called coaching. And coaching is a matter of having a coach, a big coach in most cases, that would be ridden around various places and so on, and involved in various shows especially. And of course, if you had a coach in 4 in the Vanderbilt family, all the 4 horses had to match exactly. They were all the same generation and all exactly trained. And of course, the training was a very important part of coaching. When Cornelius II died, Alfred Gwynne got the largest share of his father's estate, including Oakland Farm. Okay, here's some numbers of Cornelius II. And this is Alfred Gwynne, all dressed up. Any picture I have of him, he's always all dressed up. His wife got $2 million. This one Alfred Gwynne got $36 million. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney got 8.3, in case you can't read these numbers. Reginald, his brother, got 7.3, which he found some way to get rid of also, by the way. We'll talk about him next time. Gladys Moore Vanderbilt got 7. Cornelius, and he was the one who had been dismissed by the family, only because Alfred liked him, he got 1.3 million. Relatives, friends, servants all got 656,000, and churches and other institutions got over 1 million. That's a pretty substantial, and there's no way to compare the numbers, by the way, with today's dollars. I mean, it's just impossible. So here's Alfred Gwynne in 1907. Here's a picture of Alfred Gwynne on the box, as they said, holding the reins of the horses. And sitting next to him is his little brother Reggie, Reginald Vanderbilt, who again ended up owning and dying at Sandy Point Farm. Okay. This is a typical coach. This is probably Venture, I'm not sure. There's not enough of it to see. Venture was the really big family coach. And there are coaches, by the way, and I think Venture's there, in the museum down on Spring Street? Yeah, Spring Street in Newport. It's a nice museum. You should go there sometime. Okay, Alfred was a horseman. He did work, sort of, as much as any of them did in that day. Unlike Cornelius II, unlike his father, who had spent a lot of time involved in running the railroads and meeting with the boards of trustees and things like that. And so they really, to turn a page, excuse me, they really had, he really had, got so involved in this coaching idea that, that he sort of tuned everything else out. The British had had a tradition of coaching going back into the last century, and Alfred helped revive interest in that. And there was a traditional tour that was set up for coaches from Westminster Bridge in London down south through a number of villages to the town of Brighton, 51.5 miles away. And Alfred decided in 1908 to make that trip. The coaches were pulled by 4 to 6 horses, all matching in color, and they would wind through numerous quaint villages and the town squares on the Sussex coach, and everybody would come out to cheer them on. And Alfred became a member of a very prestigious organization in England called the Four-in-Hand Coaching Club of England. And here is Alfred on the right in this photograph. He was the whip, was the person who drove the coach, and his assistant here, Walter Fodden. They were on the Brighton Road. And this was a big show through all the towns. They knew when the coaches were coming, and they all would gather around and watch them go through the town. It's really kind of an exciting thing. So he drove to Brighton for the first time in 1908. I'm getting a little bit of too much light from this projector here. He drove with Charles Wilson, Charles Wilson was on Oakland Farm his entire career. So Charles Wilson worked there for the Vanderbilts that whole time. 1908. And he recorded in the New York Sun newspaper, he recorded his reaction. "Today has been one of the greatest days of my life. For a whole year I have been longing for my first run on the Brighton Road, but I never thought it would be like this." Again, a multi-millionaire talking about his hobby. It's kind of interesting. So he was hooked on coaching, and it was the most important part of his life thereafter, as well as other horsey kind of things. There were coaching exhibits all over the United States. There were arenas where they would bring the horses and the coaches and put them on show. They didn't race or anything like that, but they just would parade around, and in some cases there would be judging of them as to which one was best and all this. And Alfred attended a lot of coaching demonstrations, both in the United States and in Europe. He spent a lot of time in Europe. He was always involved. And Oakland Farm gained a reputation at that time of being a great farm for horse breeding. Okay, that was really a big occupation. Albert also built a hotel in New York, the Vanderbilt Hotel, at 34th and Park Avenue, which opened in 1913. And if you look at the top of that hotel, you see a little bit of a separation from the rest of the hotel, and that was his private penthouse for his family. And when he was in New York, which wasn't very often, by the way, that's where he lived. And that's where his family lived when they weren't at Oakland. They were in Oakland most of the time in the summer and extended into the fall. So now Oakland. He inherited Oakland when his father died in 1899. It was a little country farmhouse. If you look at this photograph, or postcard rather, the part of the farm this was all added, the columns and everything. But here's the farm. The farm is right in the middle. You can see there was a rather extensive addition on the back of it, and the columns and the porch and so on, that was all added. None of that was part of the Gibbs house. In fact, the whole thing seems to have been rebuilt. He put a lot of money into Oakland Farm, as you're going to see in a minute. This is another view of Oakland from the side that shows you how it extends back. And one thing that impresses me about this picture and about the building itself is the circular window that was in the middle of the chimney. How they do that, I don't know. But anyway, this is a postcard from, well, it was mailed in 1908. So you get some idea of when this was all done. Okay. There were a lot of improvements made on the farm. There was land added to the farm over the first decade of the 20th century. And as it says here, no expense was spared. What had been mainly woods and grazing land became one of the major horse farms in the United States with all the required buildings. A horse barn was built that had stalls for 90 horses. That's a pretty big barn. The riding ring that was built was at that time the largest indoor riding ring in the United States. Okay? A coach and four could easily be driven around in circles inside. Here's a map, and it's not a very good one because it's not large enough, but the only way I could get it onto a slide. This is the property at the time of Alfred Gwynne, and I'm going to point out a few things here to you. First of all, the house was here, the villa. The stable was here. The driving ring was here. And this is East Main Road, by the way. And then they had a reservoir back here. There's still reservoirs back in the woods there, or back in the edge of the farm. And they had grazing land over here. My house is on Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt's pasture. And then on the other side of Union Street, they had the farm building and all this land. This land over here went all the way down to and including Penfield. Okay? And then over here, on the other side of Sandy Point, you have Reginald Vanderbilt, Reggie's. And then over here, you have the Taylor family, Henry A.C. Taylor, and the Glenn. So that whole area, and oh, here, St. Mary's Church property here. And by the way, there was a polo field right here. Okay. And they all got involved in polo. I was recently given a great deal of information from the estate of Leonard Panaggio, who wrote the gristmill column for the Daily News for about 35, 40 years. And I got access to his files. And it's mostly newspaper files. I have acquired 7 file drawers full of mostly newspaper clippings. And Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt has 47 clippings in his folder. A lot of information about it. More detail than I can handle, frankly. Anyway, so you can get some idea of the layout of the farm from this map, if you can make out any of the small prints. There was a breeding stable down in the vicinity of where Penfield is today. It wasn't that barn, by the way. It was a north-south barn, and that one's east-west. But that's where the breeding stable was. And if you go down Sandy Point on the left, that was just all open pasture, all the way down beyond, or down to about where Penfield is. And there were gates on both sides. You've seen the gates. Some of them are still surviving, the gates for the farm. And so that was there. So this gives you a little bit of idea of the farm. It probably, at its max, was probably about 400 acres altogether. Although it grew and it shrank from generation to generation. So there's no solid number of acres that it was. But as we all know from just looking at it, it was a big chunk of land, surrounded by Sandy Point with Reginald and Oakland with the Taylors. Here's a little picture of the riding ring. These pictures are not easy to come by. I've really been mining all kinds of sources. But this is the riding ring at the top, and at the bottom is the interior of it. I have the dimensions of that, which are on the next slide, which are going to knock your socks off, I think. Again, probably the biggest in the world when it was built. Okay. The horse ring, described by the Newport Journal, which was one of the local newspapers, a mammoth building, largest private structure of its kind in the world. And it was 265 feet by 125. The roof was 65 feet above. And there was an addition 100 feet by 200 feet, which included a trophy room, lounging rooms, squash courts, a swimming pool, and had a roof garden above it. This is sort of the long view of the riding ring, with obviously well-landscaped ponds and things like that around it. So it was impressive. It was very impressive. The stables. Again, the architecture is phenomenal. It really is. And these are 2 different views of the stables, which were not far from the house itself, on the south side of the house. The farm barn. The farm barn was across Union Street, right behind the Historical Society here. And back, you may have seen not long ago, there was on the corner of Middle Road and Union Street, there were some iron railings there. I don't know if they're still there or not. Are they? Okay, that was part of the farm area, the farm buildings. And if you look at the picture on the right, you see even the cows posed for the pictures. These pictures, by the way, and let me talk about a special friend of mine. A photographer from Fall River by the name of O.E. Du Bois Oliver Edwin Du Bois, roamed around the Newport County area, primarily between about 1908 and 1912. He was in a horse and buggy. He was a photographer, and he took a lot of pictures. These are two of his right here. And as you can see, and it's true of some of them, but not all of them, he numbered them. And I started collecting his postcards. They're all sepia tone, very excellent photographs. And I was a professional photographer, so I can say that. But he did the whole area from Westport to Little Compton to Tiverton to Portsmouth to Middletown and even Jamestown. But I haven't found a picture he took of Newport yet. Maybe the horse and buggy didn't go there, I don't know. Anyway, Du Bois was a very skilled photographer. And I started collecting his photographs probably about 1974, going to flea markets. And in 1984, I wrote a book on him and selections from his photographs, because I had 64 of his postcards. How could it be many more? Well, I keep collecting them. I got 6 of them the other day at the Rhode Island Postcard Club meeting. I now have 660 of his postcards. And they're extraordinary. They are really great. They're great photographs. Anyway, so Du Bois cards, anybody ever comes across that, hey, let me know. I have a checklist. I can tell whether I have them or not. I have it by number, but I also have a bunch at the end that do not have numbers. So anyway, these are 2 of his postcards, and they're just extraordinary postcards. He captured that area. Oh, by the way, I have 3 of his postcards from Fall River, which is where he lived. I don't know why. Anyway, so O.E. Du Bois, 1908 to about 1912. He lived to about 1940. And among other people, I met his daughter a few years ago, who honored me for having kept her father's memory alive. And that was a very special meeting. Anyway, so Du Bois did those. The grounds of Oakland were immaculately kept. This picture is also up here in the cage, in the crate, up there. And you can see how time was spent. And by the way, while I'm speaking about this, all 3 of these gentlemen farms hired a lot of local help. And they used local people. In a lot of cases, they housed local people. You go down some of these streets, there are houses all along that were owned by these farms. One person for Oakland was a man by the name of J. Fred Sherman. And J. Fred Sherman lived behind here on Union Street, and his house was quite substantial. And J. Fred Sherman was elected to be the first president of the Portsmouth Historical Society in 1939. Okay. So the grounds were immaculately kept by local people in many cases, and some of those families are still around, and some of them might be here, I don't know, but the families really were part of the farm. And this is true of Oakland, Sandy Point, and the Glen. The horses stood at attention in front of the barn. As you can see, the colors of the horses were very similar, and they were all matched up. And these are some of the workers at the barn. But look at that barn. Wow. They don't make them like that anymore. Wow. Oh, now a little bit about Alfred Gwynne's personal life. He married a woman by the name of Ellen Tuck French in Newport in 1901. And they had one son, William Henry Vanderbilt III, about whom a lot of this presentation will be said about later on. He lived from 1901 to 1981. Alfred was not a good man. He got involved in a scandal with another woman, which involved her suicide. And needless to say, it also involved his divorce. Charged with adultery, and Elsie divorced him in I don't know if I have the date. It was around 1908 probably. Elsie later remarried and lived on in Newport until 1948. He later married in London a wealthy American divorcee named Margaret Mary Emerson, and she was the heir to the Bromo Seltzer fortune. And they had two children, Alfred Gwynne Jr. and George Washington Vanderbilt III. Now I'm going to give away a secret for the next part. Alfred Gwynne died in 1915. His wife remarried 2 times after his death. And Alfred Gwynne, as you can see, Alfred Gwynne lasted until 1999. And he was, I don't know, my generation can remember, probably some of you can, there was a horse in the Kentucky Derby back in the days called Native Dancer. And he owned Native Dancer. He was a horseman as well. But he just died not long ago. I don't know much about George Washington III here. Anyway, so Alfred had a pretty confused life that way. He also decided that he was going to buy a place out in the Adirondack Mountains in New York. And he bought Camp Sagamore, which was a hunting camp of 2,000 acres. It had ponds for fishing, it had woods for hunting, and so on. And it was referred to, as you can see here, a private recreational and entertainment retreat. Wow. It was fairly small when he bought it. It had been around for about 15 years when he did. And he enlarged it and dramatically improved it. And the main house, the main place where people stayed, was this. Okay. There were tennis courts, there was small golf courses, hunting, fishing, a lake called Lake Raquette, and other outdoor activities. And this was his little side thing out there in upstate New York, 2,000 acres. Interestingly about this, his first wife, Margaret Emerson, his second wife, continued to operate Camp Sagamore for nearly 40 years after his death. And it became a unique retreat in the woods for fun and for her many celebrity friends. It's still in operation. But instead of 2,000 acres, it's 7. And no longer sort of the exclusive retreat for the Vanderbilt family. Beautiful spot. Alfred spent a lot of time in England during the first part of the 20th century, the first decade or so, and was involved much in the horse culture and coaching there especially. In 1912, and keep in mind this is when people traveled across the Atlantic Ocean by ocean liner, he booked passage on a new ocean liner called the Titanic on its maiden voyage across. But for some reason, and I've been trying to research this and find out why, he canceled that trip, okay, at the last minute. And as you may know, the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank with an enormous loss of life. It's significant for what's about to follow that Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt could not swim. So later, he booked passage in 1915 on the Lusitania. Now, by this time, the European world was at war. The Germans particularly attacking shipping coming across the Atlantic. And here's the Lusitania, and here's what happened to it. It was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland, and it sank in, it's on the next slide, I think it's 18 minutes. It was close to shore. It was only about 5 or 6 miles offshore, and people on shore could see it happening. One torpedo exploded, and there are accounts of people saying, looking over the railing, saying, "Look, there's a torpedo coming." And they did not maneuver out of the way. It hit the ship, and what's interesting about it is there was an explosion, and there was a secondary explosion because Lusitania was carrying arms. under the guise of being a ocean liner. And so it sank very quickly, May 7th, 1915, torpedoed by a German submarine, and only 764 people survived and almost 1,200 died, including 123 Americans, including Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. There are several stories of interest about this sinking, one of which, when I looked in the Portsmouth town records for a will for Alfred Gwynne, there was one there, but there was a codicil to it, an account of a Miss Loney, and Miss Loney said that when the torpedo hit and when the ship was sinking, Alfred Gwynne gave her his life jacket, and then he worked hard to make sure that a lot of women and children were put in the lifeboats. In other words, he was a hero at that point, even though he couldn't swim. He was lost, his body was never recovered, and that left the whole legal profession in a great deal of confusion. He did have a will, and the major part of his will was left to his son, William Henry III, but William Henry was only 13. And so just as far as the local emphasis is, William Henry inherited Oakland Farm and a significant fortune to be claimed when he turned 21. He was only 13 at the time. Okay. So it's with William Henry that the story of Oakland Farm will continue here. And everything else is about him, essentially. William Henry Vanderbilt III, 1901 to 1981. Of that generation of the Vanderbilts, by far the most prominent locally, at least. By locally, I mean in the state of Rhode Island. He was born in New York in 1901. He was the only child of Alfred Gwynne and Ellen Tuck French. As I said, his parents divorced in 1908. His mother got a $10 million settlement and custody of William. Not that Alfred Gwynne probably wanted to have custody of children at that point, although he remarried and had 2 more children. So William inherited Oakland Farm, which at that point was designated as 450 acres, and he would receive it, as I said, on his 21st birthday. Alfred Gwynne remarried, and again, as I said, there were 2 further sons. Okay. William Vanderbilt graduated from St. George's, served as a naval cadet during World War I. He was assigned to a ship, but he was sort of like not really even a junior officer. He was a candidate. Then he went to Princeton for a short time, and eventually did not graduate from Princeton, and then went to the Evans School in Arizona. When he turned 21 in 1922, he got his inheritance, $5 million and Oakland Farm. He lived at Oakland for a long time, mostly until 1946. He still had the family hotel in New York, but he spent much time, I would say the majority of his time, at Oakland until 1946. And it was run as a poultry farm and a little bit of a horse farm, not as much as it had been under his father. But there were still horses and cows and chickens and so on. He married Emily O'Neill Davies in 1923. He had 1 daughter by her. They were divorced in 1927. He later married a woman by the name of Anne Gordon Colby in 1929, and they were divorced in 1969. They had 3 children, 3 daughters. He had a great deal of interest in transportation on Aquidneck Island. And for some of you who have heard me talk before, I do a lot with Aquidneck Island transportation. We had 2 trolley lines on the island. The first one started in 1889, the Newport and Fall River Street Railway Company. And in 1903, the Newport and Providence Street Railway Company. He was involved in the latter. He was on the board. We had two trolley lines coming from Newport. One came out the East Main Road, one came out the West Main Road. The East Main Road one went down Park Avenue, across the Stone Bridge to Tiverton, and then on to Fall River. And actually, with a few transfers, you could make your way to Nashua, New Hampshire. It would take you 4.5 hours, but you could do that. The Newport and Providence one came out the West Main Road to Bristol Ferry, where you had ferries there to take you across to Bristol. The trolley company owned the ferries as well. Okay. And in Bristol, you would get on the, it's actually a railroad that ran from Bristol through Warren up to Providence. So we had all kind of mass transport. Some of the trolley lines, especially on the West Main Road, the trolley lines had a hard time negotiating the hills, like Raytheon Hill, and they would go inland. If you're coming south on the West Main Road, and you come to let's see, well, what was the farm? The farm was there at the top of the hill before you get to Raytheon. If you look up, you'll see that the electric lines go down over the hill into the golf course, through the golf course. Well, that's where the trolley went, because it couldn't negotiate the hills as much. Anyway, trolley transportation was really big around 1900, and Island Park, as an amusement park, was built primarily as a trolley park, because you could take the trolley from Fall River down, Newport up, and celebrate. And that's another lecture of mine, but the Island Park amusement park was huge. It's hard to imagine when you look at where most of it was today, but it was really big. They had a dance hall there that would have people like Paul Whiteman or Cab Calloway come there, and they would have 2,000 people there. Really big. Again, that's another lecture. I won't get into that. Anyway, but it was a trolley park. It was built primarily for the trolley lines, built by the trolley line. Anyway, it later went into private ownership. But of course, as we all know, in 1938, there was a thing called the hurricane. And the hurricane of 38 put to rest the remains of the Island Park amusement park. It was all, most of it was all on the right-hand side of Park Avenue as you go down through Island Park. Okay. Anyway, one of the big investors and members of the board of the Newport and Fall River Street Railway Company, and the trolley lines went through several different name changes, by the way, with consolidations and incorporations and everything. One of the big people there was William Vanderbilt. And by 1915, they were losing money in spite of the crowds that came to Island Park. And we began to see more cars. We began to see jitney buses, which were small buses. And of course, they could go anywhere they wanted on any street. They weren't locked into a line of rails. Okay. So buses began to replace trolleys. And in 1925, the trolley companies went out of business. They had a few more trips, sort of memorial trips on the trolley lines, but most of the trolley cars were either destroyed or they were sent out to Bristol Ferry, where they were loaded on flat cars on the train and sent off, a number of them sent off to Asbury Park, New Jersey. Meanwhile, William Vanderbilt decided he was going to have his own bus company. So he created the Short Line in 1925. And he held on to it until 1944 when he sold out. And that too has gone through several different names since then. Here's William in front of one of his buses with the destinations there on the side of the bus. Boston, New York, Washington, Chicago, St. Louis. But also the local bus lines from Newport to Providence. Okay. In 1928, he was elected to the Rhode Island State Senate from Portsmouth. That indicates that he lived here in Oakland for a long time, a long part of the year. He He was elected as a Republican and also chosen as a state delegate to the Republican National Convention of that year, which nominated Herbert Hoover. He served in the state Senate from 29 to 35 and had a leadership role in the party. He declined to be a candidate in 1934 because of his problems with his wife's health. He was a real free thinker, though, not necessarily beholden to party's decisions. He decided in 1936 to get back into politics, and so he was interested in running for governor, 36, and he was rejected at that point. However, meanwhile, he did speak at the dedication of Founder's Brook in 1936. It was quite a production. We recently came across a collection of photographs from that day here in the museum. There are about 15 of those photographs, and they're really interesting to see how, and why was it 1936 instead of 38? Well, in 1936, Providence and Rhode Island were celebrating the 300th anniversary. And so the tricentennial was celebrated statewide. Portsmouth was founded in 1638. But anyway, so the big celebrations and the dedication of Founder's Brook was in 1936. And here's William H. speaking at that point. 1938, he decided again to run for governor. And here is his poster for that. I won't try to read it, but essentially it says, he's a great guy. So he was, and people thought so. The Republican Party thought so. So he was nominated for governor by acclamation in 1938. They didn't even vote within the party. And he led a sweep of the election in 1938 for the governor, the House, the Senate, and all the rest of the State House. The Democratic Party, I might add, at that point, this has happened before, was split, and the Republicans won everything. So he served as governor from 1939 to 1941. He was a reform governor, very independent. There were, if you can imagine, 4,000 state workers. 4,000, the whole state. He got rid of 800 of them. We didn't need those people. Well, that's not a popular stand to take for a governor. And so, and he refused to appoint people to patronage jobs and so on, and some other unpopular moves. So he was a governor for one term. He lost in 1940 to J. Howard McGrath. Here's the governor and his wife participating in some trophy presentation. I'm not sure what it was. Got the Marines there. But anyway, that's his wife around the time he was governor. In 1941, he returned to service in the Navy as a naval officer. He was assigned to various intelligence assignments and became part of what later would become known as the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, that was created during World War II. He had other intelligence assignments. He made the rank of captain and survived throughout the war until June of 1945 when he was put on inactive duty. Here's a formal portrait of his family in front of the portrait of Cornelius. I wonder what happened to that. Cornelius, the original Cornelius. And the family posed very well except for the dogs. I was a professional photographer for a while, and for 25 years, I never could get the dogs to pose, as you can see here. But anyway, this is William, his wife on his right, his oldest daughter on the left, and the two other daughters there, one of whom is important to the story later on. I'm not sure which one it was. Anyway, in front of the family portrait of the Commodore. I'm sure that's in some archive now. That's a treasured family portrait. After his naval service, he decided to sell Oakland Farm, which was at this point 150 acres. And he moved to Cricket Creek Farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts. That's out in the Berkshires. Later on, he ran a general store there and managed his family investments. With his half-brother Alfred, he bought a 35,000-acre cattle ranch in Florida. Where would there be a 35,000-acre cattle ranch in Florida? I don't know. He served on the board of directors of the New York Central Railroad, longtime family connection. and he was a trustee of Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. In 1970, he married Helen Cummins Cook of Williamstown, and he died in 1981. What happened to Oakland Farm? Oakland Farm was sold to Robert R. Young and his wife Anita O'Keefe Young in 1946. They were summer residents of a mansion in Newport called Fairholme, and Young for a while had been the board chairman of the New York Central Railroad. Sadly, he died in 40, I'm not sure of the year. He died of a suicide. The farm was in decline in the late 40s. The buildings were deteriorating. Nobody was really breeding horses anymore. In 1948, the horse barns were torn down. In 1949, the house was torn down. And in 1960, the farm barn across Union Street was torn down. This is a picture, a newspaper picture at the time. And for the person that you see right here, looks like Herb Hall. It's his father, Herbert Hall Sr. Looks just like Herb, though. Anyway, this is 1947 when they were disposing of the stock. Okay. Robert Young died in 58. He's buried in St. Mary's Churchyard over here. And as we all know, Oakland Farm came to be developed into a condominium complex with the Jean family, and which in many ways still does retain its the rural character of the property. It's come a long way from the Gibbs family rural retreat in the early 19th century, through the Vanderbilt's Gentleman's Farm and others, to what we have today. There's one later note that needs to be mentioned: the Oakland Forest. This is an aerial photograph of Oakland Forest. I took my life in my hands riding a helicopter over Oakland Forest because the people of Oakland Forest don't like to have planes and helicopters flying over. In any case, this is the forest that, well, the next slide tells how it came about. In 1999, the last portion of valuable forest was about to be destroyed for more condominiums. The initial lead motivator to save this old growth forest with beech, white oak, red oak, and maples was Matthew Largess, who was an arborist from Jamestown, and also Eleanor Kinney, who got involved in this as well. A lot of analysis was done. I was on the committee, and I was there mainly for historic reasons more than I became a master gardener later. Anyway, core samples were done and so on. People came from Cornell to do that. And the fairly new Aquidneck Land Trust got involved in this as well. Money was raised, including $1.2 million, to save this old growth forest, and it was saved. And one of the major donors to that effort was Emily Vanderbilt Wade, the oldest daughter of former Governor William H. Vanderbilt, who lived up near Boston, which is the connection I told you about before. Anyway, so you might have noticed in yesterday's Daily News, talk about current events, that the Oakland Forest got national recognition. And it is inducted into the National Old Growth Forest Network. The details were in yesterday's Daily News. Perfect timing, by the way. And I think that it's a really special place. There are trails that go through it. You can see the ruins of a rhododendron path that went through there. It's really extraordinary. And I was very happy to be a part of helping to save that. So last slide, a conclusion and a heads up. At one point they were planning the Newport Horse Show. And the people involved, this is probably about 1910, 1911, somewhere around there. And in this photograph that was taken at the Breaker Stable, the third from the left is Alfred Gwynne, Vanderbilt, and the second from the left is Reginald Vanderbilt. And it's with Reginald's farm, Sandy Point, that this series of lectures will continue sometime in the future. Not yet next week yet, but sometime soon. So with that, that's the end. I'll be happy to take questions if you have them.
Yes. Jim, I noticed in a walk.
Speak up so everybody can hear
I
you.
noticed, well, walking through the Oakland Farm, that near the rhododendrons, there is an underground bunker of some sort there, an iron gate in front of it. What did they use that for?
That was the base of a greenhouse. There was a greenhouse above that. That's the level that it was built on. Yeah, that's about the only thing left of the buildings that were there. Other questions?
Just more of a comment. I was also part of saving that because I lived on Harris Drive at the time. I now live at Oakland Farm. So I can walk in between. But it was a huge, having lived there, a real big deal. We were raising money in the neighbors to try to save, essentially save the forest and prevent Oakland Farms from building those condos that would have changed everything in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to be part of that too.
Yeah. One of the things that some people react to that forest, and there are trees in there that are between 200 and 300 years old. There were core samples were done back then. And a lot of people say that, well, all the stories say that at the time of the Battle of Rhode Island, all the trees were taken off the island. Not true. Okay? The trees were taken in Newport. They were taken in the northern part of Portsmouth. There wasn't anything going on here. I mean, the troops didn't live here. The only time the troops came by here was when they were on their way to Turkey Hill. So that forest, in my opinion, and it is an opinion, because of the work I saw done by Cornell foresters, is absolutely 200 to 300 years old. There's some wonderful trees in here. Great. Any other quick questions? We've run out of time here.
The skirmish that happened right here at the corner, have any artifacts ever been, and bullets or anything like that ever been found?
No. My son was an archaeologist, and I encouraged him very much to come over here. It's big for it. But he didn't. And to my knowledge, apparently there are some unmarked graves across the street. But nothing has been found here. It was a skirmish, not a battle. Okay, and the Americans fell back pretty quickly.
Do you know anything about
I'm going to turn this off.
the cemetery that is in Oakland Farm? There's I know there's Cornell's that are buried there.
Mm-hmm.
It's right down the street from my house. I wandered around in there, but do you know anything about the Cornells that were buried there?
Again, I mentioned them at the beginning, that they had a farm there, and they also had a farm at the other end of Union Street. And that's as much as I know about them. I've seen some deed records, things like that, but nothing. I've also heard, and I've never really found it, because I think the regimes decided to get rid of it. There's a horse cemetery in there. And they took the stones and put them in a basement somewhere, and I don't know what happened. Yeah, Charlie.
Where did the term Little Slocum Farm come from?
Yep. Wait a minute. Little Slocum Farm. Why can't I turn it off? Well, I'll close it. How's that? Little Slocum Farm was part of Oakland Farm, and is there anybody here who lived at Little Slocum Farm? There was a person in Portsmouth who did. I don't know if he's here tonight. Anyway, it was part of Oakland, really. And the horse breeding barn was there. I'm going to plug this. It's going to blow up on me. If I can. But anyway, that was part of the farm, Charlie. Yes.
Your coaching run from London to Brighton. In the 1890s, they switched to the newfangled thing called an automobile. And they still run that.
They still do?
It still runs every year, and it's open to cars built before 1904.
Great.
They run it once a year. So they switched to the new technology.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yes.
So most of the streets in Oakland Farm today are apparently named after previous owners of the property. but one street, Storm King Drive, I had heard years back that that was named after a horse.
It was. Storm King was one of Vanderbilt's favorite horses, yes. And there are a couple others, I think, in there that are horse names, too.
What was the name?
Storm King. Yeah. Any other quick questions? We're running out of time. I kept you here too long.